my goodness, you folks are on fire this morning. Wow. We don't just have 6 members in the choir, Blake. We've got 66. That was just beautiful. Just beautiful. I just don't really see any point in going on from here. We should just go home and have lunch. Yeah, I can't even tell you. So I picked that hymn for a reason. There was a time, probably in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s and maybe even in the 1990s, all the way till about, 20 minutes ago, where Max Brennan was sought after by people from all across the world to come and sing How Great Thou Art.
Maybe a little exaggeration.
Just a little. Okay, maybe it was maybe only on the top half of the equator. Anyway, Max, that's Max. Did you watch his face? Yeah, you can see the love of God is just saturated that man. And you can see it when he sings that song. Well, how's everybody today?
Very good.
Yeah, good Mother's Day? Good week? Excellent. The weather is outstanding today. It is a great day to sit on the back porch and let the TV watch me. So I may be doing that this afternoon. Where our responsive reading today in the beginning of this sermon today is set in the book of Exodus. In Exodus 3, it gives us a perfect example of God showing up as the other in the life of Moses. God spoke to Moses through a flame, through a bush that was on fire but did not burn up. God the Spirit then also appeared in the book of Acts. Do you remember that story? As tongues of fire. God's presence there was not in the form of anything we had ever imagined God would be. And the authors and the editors of sacred text, they've painted many, many beautiful pictures of God for us because God is invisible. Any of you ever seen God? Some of you are going to see God pretty soon probably, but right? We're all going to get to see God someday, but we haven't yet. We depend on the presence of others, specifically the presence of the other in our lives, to be able to see God, because God, as we talked about last week, God has an identity that is fluid and breaks into our lives in a multitude of ways. And so moving on to our text from the book of Acts. Chapter 8 tells a story of Philip. And Philip's minding his own business, doing what Philip did then, trying to figure out if believing in Jesus Christ was going to get him killed or going to get him to heaven, because it still wasn't safe all the time to be a preacher then, kind of like right this minute. And so Philip heard from the angel of the Lord to go south to the desert road that goes down from Jerusalem to Gaza. So Philip started out, and on his way he met an Ethiopian eunuch, an important official in charge of all the treasury of the Kandake, which means the queen of the Ethiopians. Now this man had gone to Jerusalem to worship, and on his way home he was sitting in his chariot reading the book of Isaiah the prophet. And the Spirit told Philip, "Go to that chariot and just stand close by there." Well, Philip went running up to that chariot, and he heard this man reading from the book of Isaiah the prophet. And Philip said to this Ethiopian eunuch, "Do you understand what you're reading?" And the eunuch said to him, "How can I understand this unless somebody explains it to me?" So this Ethiopian eunuch, this very important person in charge of the treasury, the queen of the Ethiopians, invited Philip to come sit in his carriage. And the particular passage that they were reading from the book of Isaiah is the passage where Isaiah has prophesied to the children of Israel that a Messiah is coming, and that the Messiah will be led like a sheep to the slaughter, and as a lamb before its shearer. And so he did not open his mouth. In his humiliation, he was deprived of justice. Who can speak of his descendants? For his life was taken from the earth. And the eunuch asked Philip, "Tell me, please, who is this prophet talking about? Himself or someone else?" Then Philip began with that very passage of Scripture and told him the good news about Jesus Christ. And as they traveled along the road, they came to some water, and the eunuch said, "Look, here is water. What can stand in the way of me being baptized?" And he gave orders to stop the chariot. Then both Philip and the eunuch went down into the water, and Philip baptized him. And when they came up out of the water, the Spirit of the Lord suddenly took Philip away. And the eunuch didn't see him anymore, but went on his way rejoicing. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. So in this story, it's kind of a complicated story. I can see by the look on some of your faces, I didn't read it very well. So Philip's minding his own business, and the Spirit of God sends Philip to this chariot where there is an Ethiopian eunuch, a foreigner in the country, who's reading from their sacred text. He's reading from the Hebrew sacred text, the prophet Isaiah. And it's the text that says that the Messiah will come and be led like a sheep to the slaughter. You remember when Christ stood before the judge that Christ didn't say anything. When he stood before Herod, he did not defend himself. He was quiet. You remember that. And so Isaiah had prophesied that those things would happen. And the eunuch wanted to know, what is this? Who is this person speaking of? And so Philip was able to share the gospel. Philip was able to share the truth of Jesus Christ. In that story, in that moment, Philip encountered God as Spirit. That Ethiopian encountered God as Philip. God sent Philip to that Ethiopian. God sent someone to that man to share the good news of Jesus Christ. And so that at the end of their encounter, the good news of Jesus Christ was in both their lives, and they both began to tell others. Now, I want you to keep that story in mind. I want you to keep that story in mind of God showing up and breaking through in the lives of both those men as something that we didn't expect. Now, we sang a song this morning down by the riverside. It was fun. I had a good time. Did you guys have a good time, right? Yeah, we haven't gotten applause in a while, so we must have done well today. So I appreciate you. It was a great song. It was written in 1965. How many of you were alive in 1965? Yes, quite a few of us, right? Yes, quite a few of us. And so you all remember that was a time of turmoil in the world, right? The civil rights movement was roaring through our country and through many countries. We were still living in a world that did not and had not forgotten what happened in the 1940s in World War II, the genocide of the Jewish people, the devastation of that war across the world. And at the same time, Vietnam has started. And so in the middle of all of this, in 1966, the religion editor of Time magazine wrote an article. It was the first time in the history of the magazine that there wasn't a picture on the cover or an illustration on the cover. There was only these three words: "Is God dead?" And a big question mark. How many of you, do you remember seeing that magazine article? Bob Weathers, I bet you preached a sermon about it, didn't you? Right? It was a big deal. It started a national debate that divided this country. Is God dead? You can imagine the anger and the offense that folks took at such a question being asked. And this stirred up a national debate. It created a conversation in all circles of people, religious circles, scholarly circles. In families, they were talking about it. In friendship circles, they were talking about it. Thousands and thousands of letters were written to Time magazine, both supporting the article, which was a brilliant article, by the way, and also condemning the magazine for writing such a thing on the cover. Now, I would dare to say probably the folks who condemned the magazine for what they put on the cover didn't read the article. They saw, "Is God dead?" and they put it away. They didn't even open it up to see what the answer to that question was. But the point is that in that moment, hundreds of thousands of people were stirred to have a conversation about the existence of God. One of those sermons preached during that time was by a pastor in Southern California. His name was Chuck Smith. Now, Chuck Smith had a small church. It was smaller than this one. It was maybe half the size of this one. A tiny little church, and in the 60s, they were struggling. Their membership was down. There weren't a lot of folks showing up. The folks showed up, as in this church, had more snow on the roof than they did in earlier days, if you all understand what that means. They were a little more experienced in life. And so Chuck Smith and his wife and his daughter, they're working in this church. They're doing their best, right, to try to bring the good news. And there's a movie that's just come out. It's called The Jesus Revolution. It's on Prime Video, and I have purchased that movie, and we're going to have in a couple of 3 weeks on a Friday night, we're going to gather here together and we're going to watch that movie together. It's a great movie. But anyway, in this movie, the movie is set in the 60s, right? Where this whole mess is going on in the world. The Vietnam War is going on. Racism and bigotry is running rampant. Evil is running unchecked across the face of the earth in the form of racism and bigotry. And one of the biggest stories in the 1960s were the hippies. You remember that? There's a scene in the movie with all these hippies, and the announcer on the television is saying these people are rebellious against all authority, like they're some kind of evil. And Chuck Smith's wife says, "These children, they just need help." And Chuck Smith, without even skipping a beat, says, "What they need is a bath." And you can tell he is very leery of this whole idea of these hippies, because they are not speaking in a language that he understands. They don't look like him. They don't talk like him. They sure don't smell like him. They're barefoot. They're not working. They're living in large communes. It's a completely foreign idea to him. But they were the big thing in the news then. And you know the message that they were preaching? Peace. No more war. Love. Some of the best music in the history of creation came out of the 60s. And that's one of the reasons I love this movie, is because the soundtrack is amazing. But as far as I'm concerned, you know how I feel about that, right? There's no good rock and roll written after about 1973. So it was a great, great soundtrack. But part of this movie, it's not just about what was going on there, but it's about something that happened there. Thus the name of the movie, The Jesus Revolution. And one of the characters in this movie is a man named Greg Laurie. Anybody know who Greg Laurie is? Greg Laurie still preaches. He runs an organization called Harvest America. And he has these huge gatherings all across the world where he preaches the gospel and shares the word of Christ. And the message of Greg Laurie, while it's a little too conservative for me, it also has some brilliant reminders for us to feed people and to clothe people and to give them shelter and safety and love. And so I appreciate the work that he's done. But Greg Laurie started right here as one of these hippies in a commune that became part of Chuck Smith's church. Now, at the beginning of the movie, they're watching this story on the news, and Smith says to his wife, "When God walks in here and brings me a hippie, I will ask him what this is all about, because I don't understand." Well, so you all know what happens when you challenge God, right? God shows up. And so a few days later, Chuck Smith gets up in the morning and he's making his coffee, and he turns around and there's a hippie standing in his living room, drinking coffee, walks over, gives him a big giant hug. And of course, Chuck Smith, he has no idea who this guy is. Well, this man's name is Lonnie Frisbee, and he showed up in Chuck Smith's house, and he said to him, my people, talking about all those hippies, they're lost, and they're looking for something, and they need church." And he looked him right in the eyes and he said, "But buddy, the door to your church is closed." God sent somebody to tell Chuck Smith, "We got to change our ways here, dude. We're not getting the message across. We're not sharing the good news of Jesus Christ with the doors closed." And so before you know it, Chuck Smith has opened his church to these hippies. He keeps the doors open 24 hours a day because most of them didn't have any place to live. And so not only did they join there with his small church, at least the ones who didn't leave, because they were mad that the hippies were in their building. There was one man who says they're getting the carpet all stained because their feet is dirty. They don't wear shoes. And so in the next scene, you see Chuck Smith on his knees with a bowl of water washing their feet before they come into the church. I mean, this man had a complete change of heart. He turned his whole attitude around from they need a bath to let me give them a bath. And this church, it began to fill quickly with these hippies, with these children lost and looking for love and acceptance and safety. And before you knew it, they were wall to wall and standing and sitting in the aisles and gathered all around. And there was music with guitars and drums, Max. It would have made you crazy. And they're singing and they're praising God and they're talking about the love of Jesus and they're going into the ocean to be baptized. And it is beautiful. And Lonnie Frisbee looks at Chuck Smith's one day and he says, "We're going to need a bigger church." And soon, before you even know what's going on, it has grown into a national movement. And so that young people, hippies, freaks, all across the world, all across the United States especially, are finding the good news of the gospel. Now, Jesus showed up in the life of Chuck Smith as other. Chuck Smith didn't find the word of Jesus in his Bible, although he thought that's where it was. He didn't find the message of the gospel in the hymns he was singing or the sermons he was preaching. He found it in this dirty, smelly hippie who showed up in his life and just loved on him and gave him a big, giant hug. And God breaks into our lives the same way every single day. God shows up as other in our lives. And when I say other, I mean those folks who live at the margins. We keep them out here because they make us uncomfortable. They don't look like us. They don't smell like us. They don't love like us. We don't understand the language they speak. We don't understand what motivates them. We don't understand what gives them purpose. So we keep them out here so that we don't have to look at them, that we don't have to deal with them. And I think about that. I think about that a lot. That magazine in 1966, that Time magazine that said, "Is God dead?" I wonder if today the question should be, have we killed God again? With our absolute refusal to open our minds and to recognize that God shows up in the forms that we don't understand, that we don't recognize. Have we killed God again by our refusal to accept the fact that God is not male and God is not female? God is neither, and God is everything in between that. Have we killed God again by refusing to understand that our bodies and our souls are not eternally connected? These bodies wither. It is our soul that is eternal. This body is not my identity. Thank God, because I broke this one. It is my soul that is my identity. My body carries me in the same way that my car carries me to church. It's just a machine, and my soul is not connected to it eternally. Have we killed God again by refusing to believe that sometimes the eternal soul is not in a body that matches who it believes it is? Folks that struggle because their soul doesn't match their machine. Folks who they live in despair and distress because they've got the body of a race car inside a Volkswagen and it just doesn't fit. And have we killed God again by putting those people out there and rejecting them? Have we killed God again by refusing to accept the difference between sin and just the randomness of science? Another question might be, is the church relevant even any longer? Are we meeting people where they are? I mean, can we really walk with someone through their crisis if we expect them to show up here all the time? What if they can't get here, folks? What if there's no car? What if they haven't had enough food to have the strength to walk into these doors? And how do they know when they get here that these doors aren't closed? I mean, we lock our doors. We have to, because we live in a society where it's not safe anymore to be gathered in a church. So we lock our doors to keep ourselves safe. But do you know what else we have? We have cameras so that we can see if anybody comes to the door and knocks. And we meet them there and we greet them there. But the church, are we still relevant? In 1966, when this article was written, 97% of Americans believed in God. 97% believed in God. But in the face of the horrors of the Vietnam War, the horrors of racism, of bigotry and hate, people began to ask questions. They began to wonder about God. Young people especially began to question everything as they were seeking for love and for peace and safety. They wondered why the church was so violent against them. And where was the church? Holding up its hand, blocking the door to those in need of shelter. But then just a few years later, in 1971, the Jesus Revolution took hold. And the world changed a little bit for a little while. And Chuck Lorre, this hippie that came out of that movement, he's still preaching today. Millions of people a year hear the sermons of Chuck Lorre. I encourage you to listen. They are very, very inspiring, very moving. But let's fast forward right now to 2023, because this article has come up again. It just had its 50th anniversary in 2016. And the title again said, "Is God Dead Again After 50 Years?" But let's talk about 2023. In the age group of 18 to 29-year-olds, there's a few of you out here, Blake and Shannon, I'm talking to you guys, 18 to 29-year-olds. And then we've got a nice group of young people back over here. And no, Bill Parker, I'm not pointing at you. Back over there, the young people. 55% of people in the United States identify as Christian between the ages of 18 and 29. 8% of those folks identify as non-Christian, but they believe in God. 36% of 18 to 29-year-olds in 2023 do not believe in God. Believe there is no God. And 1%, they don't know. They're not sure, one way or the other. Now here's the shocking fact. Of those 55% who claim to be Christian, 68% of them believe in heaven. 56% of them believe in hell. But 51% of that 55%, so half of those folks between the ages of 18 and 29, they're not sure if God really exists. And so they call themselves Christians, but they've not really heard the good news of Jesus Christ, because they're still not sure that God exists. Only half of people from 18 to 29 are certain that God exists. Only 40% of them even believe that religion is important at all. Well, I mean, we're struggling to get young people in this church. Some of that is our fault, but a lot of it is because the society we live in. Kids don't go to church anymore. Families don't go to church. Sunday is the day you get the yard done and the laundry done, and you forget about the importance of rest and of Sabbath. My question to you, St. Matthew, has the church become this judgmental, exclusionary, behemoth organization that focuses on people's differences instead of the one thing that connects us all? And that is that we are all loved by God. Now, I have never fancied myself an evangelist. I didn't grow up, well, I grew up in a situation where evangelist was a dirty word in my house, at least in my room. My parents thought it was great, but I didn't understand. Because what I heard from evangelists growing up was I was going to hell, that I was an abomination, that I would never be worthy. Or on the other hand, what I heard, what many of you heard is, it's your fault. It's your sin. It's your horribleness that put Jesus on the cross. And so I lived in that space between abomination and murderer. And I'd never heard about the love of Jesus Christ and the mercy and the grace of Jesus Christ until I was an adult. I was 35 years old. And then I walked in here just a few years ago, way past 35, but not quite as old as I am now. And I got to hear the message, the good news that Jesus Christ loves me, that Jesus Christ knew who I was going to be the moment God said, "Let there be light." And Jesus Christ knew who you would be, whether you were in the right body or not, whether you were born into the right family or not. God knew you, God loved you, and God gave God's self for you. And so for as long as I live, for the rest of my life, the good news of Jesus Christ will fall from these lips until I can't talk anymore. And I want to fling wide the doors of this church, because just as there were folks in the 1960s lost and looking for love, they're still out there, folks. They're still out there, and they look like the other. I'm ready for a church where people are lined up and they're sitting in the aisle because there's no more room in the seats. I'm ready for a church that's open 24 hours a day, because we've got a space for people to sleep who have no bed, and we've got a kitchen that makes meals for people who have no food, and a little office where a couple of retired nurses sit and take blood pressures, and talk to people about their diabetes. I'm ready for that church. It's why I'm doing what I'm doing. And it's why I'm with you, because I know you're ready for that church as well. You've been in this same place where you or your children or your siblings or your parents or someone in your life that you loved was told, "No, you can't come in here. You need a bath." And God brought us all here together for this moment to share that good news. Pray with me, please. God, we know that the good news of Jesus Christ, well, it's a story of love. It's a story of safety. It's a story of laughter and good food and quiet time spent with you. And we know that in the presence of the good news of the love of Jesus Christ, that we're standing on holy ground. And all the people said, amen.